Mist drifted through the glass bridges of Cherelia like breath leaking from broken pipes, curling slow before the wind tore it apart. The city above the ocean was a lattice of stilts and shimmering panels, its foundations anchored against the silver waves that hammered ceaselessly below. Inside one of the nursery pods clinging to the lower terraces, Arya Zell sat on the floor before an empty cradle. Her hair, long and black, hung in tangled ropes down her shoulders, damp with condensation that the failing mist filters no longer cleared. Her lips moved with a sound so low it barely carried, a lullaby without words, each note rising and falling like she was testing the shape of grief itself. The cradle was silent, the air faintly chilled. Still, she sang. Her hands rested against her knees, trembling but steady enough to keep the melody from breaking. Her voice had become a ritual, the only way to hold on to the daughter that had been swallowed by an official line in a transit log, dissolved during transfer. The world had already forgotten, but Arya could not. She kept the cradle lit. She kept the air running even when the filaments cracked. She kept singing to a space that refused to answer. Her breath came unevenly, but she did not stop. To stop was to accept. The pod hummed faintly with failing systems heat, lattice flickering amber, filters pulsing in broken rhythm. Arya's eyelids were raw from sleepless cycles, but she stayed upright, voice trembling around the edges of a song no one else knew. Her shoulders curved inward around absence, and still she clung to the ritual. Then the door hissed. Arya's song cut off sharp, leaving the silence heavier than before. She didn't move at first, only felt the damp air shift against her skin. Her breath caught in her throat. No one came here anymore. She had been written out, forgotten, and yet the seal released. Warm, damp air from the corridor touched her cheek. A figure stepped inside, broad-shouldered, boots wet with mist, hair damp from the fog. His jaw was set hard, his eyes flat with a focus she recognized instantly as human quiet, heavy with purpose. In his arms he carried a bundle, wrapped tight in a thermal shawl that steamed faintly in the chill air. His steps were measured, but his shoulders ached under the weight of more than just the climb. Arya's gaze fixed on the bundle. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man lowered to one knee, steady and deliberate, and unwrapped the shawl just enough. A small face stirred beneath it, skin coral pale, lips cracked but alive. Tiny fingers twitched against the fabric, clutching weakly at the edge of the wrap. The child's shallow breaths came in fragile rhythm, each one a defiance against the word dissolved. Arya's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a heartbeat, she thought her grief had finally broken her mind, conjured a vision too cruel to be real. Her knees nearly buckled when the child whimpered, the faint rasp of breath cutting through the silence. The man spoke, voice low, controlled. Arya Zell, her head lifted as if pulled by a string. His words pressed through the haze that had cocooned her for 3 cycles. Her eyes, red from sleepless nights, locked on the bundle again. "Who are you?" Her voice was flat, empty of trust. "Kashin Cade, transit recovery." His tone carried no apology, only fact. "I found her." The world tilted. Arya stumbled forward, knees shaking. Her hands reached out before she knew she was moving. At first her grip was uncertain, trembling, but when the shawl settled into her arms, the instinct surged back. She pressed her face into the child's neck, breathing in faint traces of nursery soap and salt air clinging to the fabric. Heat bled against her chest, a pulse so weak but undeniably real. The child shifted with a broken little sound, and Arya's shoulders jerked, half sob, half breath crushed into silence. Her throat closed around a cry that couldn't escape. She clutched the girl tighter, her voice finally breaking through as a fractured whisper. "Sorry?" Kashin stayed kneeling on the floor, his hands resting open against his thighs. He didn't move to take the child back. He didn't interrupt. He let the moment hold, let Arya's trembling resolve itself into the steady grip of a mother who had been forced too long into grief. Her tears fell silently against her daughter's dry skin. For the first time in cycles, the cradle was no longer empty. Kashin kept still as Arya's arms locked around the child, her trembling slowing only when the girl's faint pulse pressed against her collarbone. The nursery pod was silent, except for the weak hiss of broken filters and the shallow rasp of Sori's breathing. Arya didn't look at him, not yet. Her face was buried in the child's neck, lips moving against warm skin in murmurs too soft to catch. The lullaby had turned into words, fragmented, private, meant only for her daughter's ears. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes burned with more than exhaustion. "You should have taken her to Med Bay." Kashin exhaled once through his nose, not sharp, just controlled. He had rehearsed this answer a dozen times on the climb. They'd have logged her as unidentified. The inquiry alone would have taken days. "You were 30 minutes away." Arya's grip tightened. "And if she had died on your way here?" "She didn't." His voice held no apology. He glanced at the failing wall filaments. Amber light sputtered weakly, casting broken shadows across Arya's face. "But she will if the lattice fails completely." Arya blinked, as if realizing the state of her pod for the first time. Her whole world had been the empty cradle, the song, the silence. The rest had blurred into background decay. Kashin moved finally, slow enough not to startle her. He set his pack on the counter and unlatched it. "I'll stabilize the heat lattice and replace the mist filters. She needs humidity and warmth before food will help." Arya's eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring through her grief. "You're not a medic." "No." He pulled a portable coil from the pack and clipped it to the basin. "I recover what's lost." Something flickered behind her stare, a fracture line between fury and exhaustion. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted Sori to one arm and rubbed her thumb across the child's cheek. The baby stirred faintly, mouth opening in a weak reflex. Kashin filled a cup with warm water and knelt beside her. He touched a drop to Sori's lips. The girl swallowed, a sound so small it was almost silence. He waited 10 breaths before giving another. Arya's shoulders dropped, fraction by fraction, as she watched the fragile rhythm of her daughter's throat moving. "She'll take more slow," Kashin said quietly. "Digestive shock if we rush." Arya's breath caught. Her voice was raw. "You speak like you've done this before." "Not with children." He set the cup aside and checked the cracked lattice panel. "But close enough." His fingers worked with steady precision, resealing frayed filaments, coaxing the heat back in slow pulses. The glow shifted from sputter to steadiness. Arya's skin began to shimmer faintly at her freckles, the bioluminescence returning with warmth. She held her daughter closer, voice rough but steadier. "Why risk all this for us?" Kashin didn't look back at her. He kept his hands on the panel until the lattice held firm. Then he spoke, calm and absolute. "Because she's your daughter, and someone needed to walk her back." Arya stared at him for a long moment, her throat tightening around words she couldn't form. She pressed her cheek to Sori's soft hair and whispered a sound between sob and sigh. The pod was still weak, still failing in places, but for the first time in cycles, it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive again. Kashin unrolled a floor mat by the door, boots off, belt coiled within reach. He sat straight-backed, eyes scanning the room, every movement deliberate. He didn't announce himself as guardian. He didn't need to. The way he took position made it clear. If anyone came through that door, they would meet him first. Arya's voice broke the silence once more, soft, testing. "You'll stay?" Kashin met her gaze without hesitation. I said I would. Something in her expression cracked, not trust, not yet, but the smallest edge of belief. She nodded once, sharp and uncertain, and turned back to the cradle. The lullaby returned, low and trembling, but this time not for an empty space. This time the song had weight. This time it carried warmth. Rain ticked against the dome above the pod, a steady percussion that blurred the city lights into pale streaks. The sound should have lulled her, but Arya sat stiff against the cradle, one hand pressed flat to the tiny rise and fall of Sori's chest. Every shallow breath sent a pulse through her, each exhale a knife edge between relief and terror. Sleep had abandoned her days ago. She had learned not to chase it. Across the pod, Kashin remained by the door. His boots were set neatly to the side, belt coiled at arm's reach, spine straight against the wall. He looked like part of the structure itself, unmoving, unblinking. His gaze never drifted far from the cradle, though his expression betrayed nothing. Arya found herself watching him between glances at her child. She told herself it was suspicion. In truth, it was because his stillness steadied the air more than the broken lattice ever could. Hours passed like that, her rocking gently, him unmoving. The mist filters hissed in uneven intervals, a pulse of vapor rising and thinning in rhythm with the lullaby she still hummed under her breath. When she finally whispered, her voice sounded foreign in the quiet. "You're a soldier." He didn't shift. Was. Her eyes narrowed. That's not how men from recovery stand guard at doors. Kashin's jaw tightened briefly before he answered. I kept people alive once. Different context. Same rules. Arya's fingers stroked Sori's hairless scalp, her touch trembling. You came here without orders. You broke protocol. I did. The admission hung between them, blunt and unvarnished. Arya almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. Why? He looked at her for the first time in hours, dark eyes steady. Because the system already wrote her off, dissolved, cargo lost in fog. If I hadn't found her, no one else would have bothered. Arya's grip tightened on the child. Rage sparked briefly through the exhaustion in her chest, a flare hot enough to sting her eyes. They came, she whispered. When she vanished, they came, filled out forms, spoke as if I weren't in the room. Then they left. They left me singing to an empty cradle. Kashin inclined his head once. Not pity, not apology. Just acknowledgement. I'm not here for forms. Arya searched his face for a crack, for irony, for any hint of the dismissal she had grown used to. There wasn't one. He sat like a sentinel carved from the glass walls, all his weight bent toward the same quiet refusal she had clung to alone. A sudden shift in Sori's breathing pulled her attention back. The child's chest rose deeper than before, her lips parting with a faint hiccup. Arya froze, staring, terrified to move in case it stopped. Kashin leaned forward slightly, his tone unchanged, but his gaze sharpened. That's good. Stronger than earlier. Arya exhaled, trembling from relief. Her eyes blurred as she bent over the cradle, pressing her forehead to the shawl that wrapped her daughter's body. She's really here, she whispered, as if she still doubted the truth of it. Alive, Kashin said simply. Arya didn't thank him. She couldn't not when gratitude felt like it would snap what fragile strength she had left. Instead, she kept her palm over Sori's ribs, listening to the faint rhythm of breath and heartbeat under her hand. Her voice was unsteady, but it carried. You'll stay? I told you. His reply was calm, but absolute. If anyone comes through that door, they go through me first. Arya swallowed hard, her throat aching. Something inside her, part suspicion, part hollow defiance, tilted toward belief. She shifted onto the floor mat beside the cradle, curling around it like she could shield both child and pod from the city outside. Kashin remained upright by the door, arms folded, eyes scanning the room. Guard duty without command, watch kept without sleep. He had been sent to recover cargo, nothing more. Yet he stood here now, holding a vigil no one had asked for, and Arya understood the truth in her bones. For the first time in 3 cycles, she let her eyelids lower. Not fully, not trust, but enough. The lullaby found her lips again, softer this time, carried on the hum of restored warmth. The cradle wasn't empty anymore, and the room wasn't silent. Dawn came to Sherelia in a haze of gray light diffused through the mist. The bridges outside the pod shone slick with condensation, droplets clinging before sliding into the ocean far below. Arya sat cross-legged on the floor, her daughter cradled against her chest, watching the pale glow spread across the glass. Her body ached from sleeplessness, but her mind refused to loosen its grip on the fragile weight in her arms. Every breath from Sori was a thread binding her to the present. Behind her, Kashin rolled his floor mat with the same precise economy he had shown all night. He strapped it into his pack, checked the buckle twice, then pulled on his boots. Arya heard the subtle shift in his movement and tensed immediately. "You're leaving." His answer was simple. "Supplies." Her arms locked around Sori instinctively, her voice breaking sharper than she intended. "No, not now." Kashin crouched by the counter, sorting what little remained in the food, drawer half a slab of dried root, a jar of powder long past date. He set them aside in a clean line. "You have maybe 1 day of nutrition left. 2, if you starve yourself." He didn't look at her, only the empty shelves. "The pod won't keep her alive without more." Arya's breath hitched. She hated that the truth came dressed in his bluntness. "Then I'll go." "She needs you here." He shook his head. "They know your face. If anyone tampered with that cradle, if they see you on the market floors, they'll know she lived. Right now, the fewer who know, the better." Arya's heartbeat thundered in her ears. "And if you don't come back?" Kashin finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable, voice steady as stone. "I said I would." The words landed heavier than she wanted them to. Her throat tightened. She wanted to throw them back, to spit that words had failed her before, that promises dissolved as easily as mist. But her daughter stirred against her chest, fingers curling weakly into the fabric of her shawl, and Arya bit down on the words until they died. Kashin checked the seal on his pack, adjusted the strap across his shoulder. At the door panel, he paused, glancing back. "I'll knock 3 times. Pause. Once, no other pattern. If it's not that, you don't open." Arya nodded once, sharp. His gaze lingered just long enough to feel like something more than procedure. "Eat. Drink. You don't get to collapse while I'm gone." Her lips twitched in something close to bitter amusement. "That almost sounds like concern." "It's logistics," he said, and pressed his palm to the door. The seal released with a hiss, cool mist curling into the pod. He stepped out, boots whispering on glass, and was gone. The silence after the lock clicked shut, pressed hard against her ribs. Arya stood frozen for several breaths, eyes fixed on the sealed door, waiting for it to open again, terrified it never would. Finally she turned, carrying Sori back to the cradle. The child stirred faintly, mouth opening for a soft sound that wasn't quite a cry. Arya brushed her cheek against her daughter's head, whispering the only command she could give the universe. "Come back." Outside, Kashin descended into the fog layers, hood drawn low, every movement measured. The city's markets were stirring awake, stall keepers steaming tea, drones mapping routes overhead. He kept to the quiet tunnels, avoiding authority lanes, boots leaving no sound but the faint hiss of damp glass underfoot. His mind moved faster than his body, mapping exits, calculating which vendor would ask the fewest questions. which shadow he could disappear into if someone followed Dot by the time the crowd thickened above. He had already gathered what was needed: root slabs, seed powder, child cloth wraps, distilled cartridges. He moved with the quiet anonymity of a man who refused to be remembered. Back in the pod, Arya rocked her daughter in silence, every beat of her heart measuring the distance between breaths and the possibility that the door would open again. The cradle glowed faintly in its repaired warmth. She hummed the lullaby once more, but softer now, her voice cracking in places, as if she were singing not just to her child, but to the hope that the man who carried her back would return. Again, the pod smelled of damp fabric and stale broth by the time the door opened again. Arya had nearly worn a groove in the floor, pacing between the cradle and the counter, Sori bundled against her chest. The knock came exactly as he said, 3 sharp raps, a pause, then one more. She froze, breath caught in her throat. Her hands clutched the child so tightly Sori stirred with a faint whimper. When the panel slid back, mist rolled inside, and Kashin filled the doorway, boots wet, pack heavy. He stepped through without ceremony, sealing the lock behind him. Arya's knees went weak at the sight, relief flashing through her like pain. But she forced herself upright. You were gone too long. 5.5 hours, he said, already setting his pack on the counter. Beacon stayed dark? She nodded. No one came. Good. He unlatched the pack and laid out his haul with the same neat precision as before: root slabs sealed in wax, jars of crushed froin seed, new cloth wraps, distilled orn cartridges, heat backs, a new mesh cradle lining folded crisp at the end of the row. Arya hovered close, eyes darting from the supplies to him, suspicion still tangled with the relief that she couldn't quite hide. Why are you doing this? He didn't look up from sorting. Because she's alive. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Sori stirred again, tiny hands clutching the edge of Arya's shawl. Kashin finally crouched beside the cradle, fingers brushing the mesh. His gaze shifted to the child, his voice dropping. Stronger. Her pulse is better. Arya sank onto the floor mat, clutching her knees. Her voice was thin. Where did you find her? Not to skim her the truth. Kashin glanced up at her, then away, as if weighing the cost of speaking. Cradle was sealed from the outside, her throat closed. What do you mean, sealed? I mean someone put her in, wrapped her in your shawl, and shut the hatch. It wasn't drift damage. It wasn't accident. Arya's breath hitched, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked at her daughter, then back at him. Someone left her there. Yes, his tone didn't soften. And someone wiped the manifest after the declaration. Officially, she was dissolved. Case closed. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. Arya's grip on Sori shook until the child whimpered again, grounding her. She pressed her lips to the baby's crown, her breath ragged. Kashin set his handheld on the counter and powered it on. Code filled the display, lines broken and jittering. He rotated it until the fragments sharpened, stabilizing just enough. I pulled part of the erased log. Not all, but enough. A courier ID. Arya stared at the flickering numbers as though they were a death sentence. Who? Contract license scrubbed. Real identity buried under shell accounts. Whoever paid him knew how to cover tracks. Her voice broke into a whisper. Why? I don't know yet. But I'll find out. Arya lowered her forehead to the cradle rail, one hand still locked on her daughter. Her shoulders shook, but no tears came. She had burned through all of them in the weeks of silence. When she lifted her head again, her face was pale but set. What do we do? Kashin's gaze held hers, steady as stone. First we keep her alive. Then we find who did it. Her lips parted as if to argue, then closed. Her throat worked once before she nodded. Not trust, not yet, but an answer. Kashin reached for the new mesh lining, unwrapping it with quick precision. Arya shifted Sori against her shoulder, her hand trembling less than before. Together, without words, they began to rebuild the cradle. The pod dimmed to its evening pulse, ember light rising and fading like the lungs of a tired sleeper. Arya sat on the floor with Sori nestled in the crook of her arm, rocking slowly, the lullaby humming against her lips. Her daughter's skin glowed faintly where freckles mirrored heartbeat, stronger now than the night before. Each faint flicker steadied Arya, but the steadiness cracked when she glanced at the door. Kashin was strapping his pack again. No, her voice cut sharper than she intended. Not tonight. He didn't stop. He pulled his jacket on, checked the inside seam for the slim blade he kept hidden. The erased manifest points deeper. Central Archives. Off-network junction. His tone was flat, like he was listing supply needs. If I wait, fragments will rot. Arya's grip tightened around her daughter. You can't leave her again. You can't leave me again. Kashin looked over, expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed steady on hers. You fed her yourself today. That doesn't mean. It means you can, he said. And you will. 4 hours. 6 at most. Arya's chest heaved with a breath that shook. If you don't come back, I will. His voice carried no hesitation. I don't say things I don't mean. She hated how much weight the words carried. Hated that part of her wanted to believe them. Kashin crossed to the wall panel, set the beacon blocker, and keyed a manual lock. The pod lights flickered as its signature vanished from the network. No one will know this room exists until I return. If someone knocks, it won't be me. He glanced over his shoulder. 3. Pause 1. Nothing else. Arya nodded tightly, throat too dry to speak. He lingered at the door just long enough for the silence to press between them. Eat, drink, sleep when she does. Logistics again? Her voice cracked. His mouth twitched, almost the shape of a smile. Habit. The door hissed open and closed behind him, mist curling in and out like breath. And then he was gone. Arya stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the darkened lock panel. The pod was silent, but for the hiss of the filters and Sori's shallow breaths. She carried her daughter back to the cradle, laid her down gently, then lowered herself onto the floor mat. Her palms pressed flat against her knees, trembling with leftover panic. Come back, she whispered, too quiet for even the sensors to catch. Outside, Kashin moved like water through the fog belts. His boots made no sound against the wet glass, his hood pulled low, eyes scanning arcs of drone paths and scaffold shadows. He kept to the freight tunnels where sensors had corroded years ago, slipping between markets half asleep, stall-keepers steaming morning tea. By the time the crowds thickened, he was already climbing freight lifts, invisible among crates. When he reached the Archives junction, he slipped into a forgotten maintenance shaft and jacked into the terminal. Code spilled across his handheld, fractured and raw. He dug careful, pulling threads one by one. Too fast and the system would flare, alerting someone. He had done this before with lost cargo, erased shipping contracts, falsified payouts. But never with something breathing on the other end. Hours bled past in silence, broken only by the hum of his handheld, and the faint hiss of mist through cracked vents back in the pod. Arya swayed where she sat. Her body ached, her eyes burned, but when Sori stirred, she was ready. She lifted her daughter, pressed her to her shoulder, and fed her from the thin broth Kashin had left cooling. Her hands steadied more than she expected. She whispered to the child, words she hadn't said in days. You're warm. You're strong. You're here. The lullaby returned, softer, steadier. For the first time since she'd lost her, Arya realized she was not just waiting for the world to take Sori away again. She was holding her, keeping her, breathing with her dot, and somewhere in the mist, a man who refused to let the word dissolved stand in a ledger kept digging, one line of broken code at a time, toward the truth. Mist clung to Kashin's jacket when he stepped back through the pod door. He gave the knock exactly as promised. 3, pause 1, and the seal slid open. Arya was already there, barefoot on the cold tile, eyes hollow with exhaustion, but sharp with something fiercer. Her arms locked around Sori, as though even a breath between them could invite the world to steal her away again. "You're late," she whispered, voice rough with hours of holding steady. 6 hours, he said, pulling the door shut and keying the lock. "Had to reroute twice. They've put sensors back on the freight lifts." Her shoulders stiffened. "Did they see you?" He shook his head, water dripping from his hood. "Not me. Not yet." He unstrapped the pack, crouched by the counter, and pulled out a datapad wrapped in insulating cloth. "But they'll know someone was inside the archives. They'll start looking." Arya hovered close, every muscle taut. "Did you find it?" Kashin unwrapped the pad, set it on the table, and brought it to life. The screen filled with broken text, jittering lines of code. He worked steady fingers across the interface until fragments stabilized enough to read. One line pulsed brighter than the rest a registry tag, half corrupted but unmistakable. Arya drew in a sharp breath. "That's the courier." "Yes." Kashin's voice had gone cold, not louder, just stripped of anything but resolve. Contract license was false. His real ID buried under 6 shells. Someone paid him to make sure the Cradle never reached the upper dome. Arya's grip on her daughter trembled. Who paid him? Kashin closed the pad, wrapping it again as if sealing away something corrosive. "I can trace it, but it won't be fast. If I push too hard, they'll burn what's left of the trail." Arya lowered her forehead to Sori's crown, her breath hitching. So it was an accident. Someone wanted her gone. Yes. A single word hollowed the pod. Silence followed, thick with the weight of it. Arya's jaw clenched until her teeth ached. She swayed where she stood, then lowered herself to the cradle's edge, setting Sori gently down. The child stirred, small fingers curling weakly against the new mesh. Arya's eyes stayed fixed on her daughter, voice breaking low. "For cycles, I thought it was my fault. That I hadn't sealed her cradle right. That I missed something." "You didn't," Kashin said. He moved closer, crouching to meet her eye level. "Someone took her, sealed her in, and erased the record." Arya finally looked at him, amber irises bright with fury through the tears. "Then we fight." Kashin nodded once. "We'll build this place so solid they can't touch her. And then we'll find who paid for her to vanish." Arya's throat worked. Her shoulders dropped, but not in defeat. The lullaby that had once been only grief now lived on her lips as something sharper. She reached into the cradle, let Sori's tiny hand grasp her finger, and whispered, "You're not lost anymore." Kashin stood sentinel by the door, arms folded, eyes scanning as rain whispered against the dome outside. He had recovered countless things marked dissolved. But tonight, he carried the weight of something more. This was no longer just about recovery. This was about ensuring no system, no hand, no shadow in the fog ever dared to erase them again.